In the year 1687, behind the towering walls of Topkapi Palace, there existed a world that history has tried desperately to forget. A world where beauty was currency, where youth was harvested like crops, and where the most powerful man in 3 continents kept an institution so shadowed, so deliberately obscured, that even today, its full truth remains wrapped in silk and silence. This is the story of the boys who were taken, transformed and consumed by the machinery of Ottoman absolute power. The Ottoman Empire at its zenith stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, from the shores of Algeria to the mountains of Persia. Within this vast dominion, the Sultan was not merely a monarch, but the shadow of God on earth, a figure whose will was law and whose desires shaped the fate of millions. Yet for all this power projected across continents, some of the Sultan's most profound influence was exercised in the most intimate spaces of his palace, upon the bodies and souls of young boys who would never return to the lives they once knew. These were not the children of nobility seeking advancement. They were not volunteers in any meaningful sense of the word. They were Christian boys, primarily from the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Circassia, taken through the Devshirme system or purchased outright in the slave markets that dotted the empire's provinces. Some were as young as 8 years old when they arrived at the palace gates, torn from villages where their mothers still wept and their fathers stood powerless against the Sultan's collectors. The initial selection was brutal in its precision. Ottoman officials sought specific qualities: fair skin, symmetrical features, quick intelligence, and above all, an unspoiled quality that could be molded. Families occasionally volunteered their sons, seeing in this forced servitude a path to survival or advancement, but most children were simply taken. The transaction was recorded in ledgers, with the same casual efficiency used to inventory horses or bolts of cloth. A boy's former name, his family, his faith, all became irrelevant the moment he passed through the palace's gate of salutation. Upon arrival, the transformation began immediately. Each boy was stripped, bathed, and inspected like livestock. Their Christian names were discarded and replaced with Turkish or Persian names that severed their connection to their past. They were circumcised in a ceremony that was both religious conversion and symbolic castration of their former identity. Many became ill during this period. Some died. The survivors learned their first lesson in the Ottoman system. Your body was no longer your own, and resistance was futile. The boys were then assigned to the Enderun, the palace school that served as a hothouse for cultivating the Sultan's most trusted servants. This was not education in any humane sense. It was systematic psychological reconstruction. They learned Ottoman Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. They studied the Quran and Islamic law until they could recite passages perfectly. They practiced calligraphy until their hands cramped, learned music until they could perform flawlessly, and trained in horsemanship and archery until they moved with lethal grace. But beyond these practical skills, they learned something far more essential to their survival: how to read the desires of power. They learned to move silently through corridors, to bow with precisely the correct depth, to speak only when addressed, and to make themselves beautiful in ways that transcended mere appearance. They learned to cultivate an appealing vulnerability, a submissive charm that would catch the Sultan's eye without seeming to seek it. This was the most dangerous skill of all, for to be noticed was both the path to everything and the road to destruction. The palace hierarchy was merciless. The boys were organized into chambers based on their progress and favor. The lowest worked in the kitchens and stables, anonymous laborers whose faces the Sultan would never see. The next tier served in the outer chambers, where they might catch a distant glimpse of their master. But the ultimate destination, the goal that haunted every boy's dreams and nightmares, was the Has Oda, the privy chamber, where the Sultan's most intimate attendants resided. Entry into the privy chamber was determined by a combination of skill, beauty, and pure chance. The Sultan might notice a boy during a ceremony, or a eunuch official might recommend someone he believed fit the imperial taste. Sometimes it was a matter of being in the right place, when the Sultan's gaze swept across a line of pages, but once selected, a boy's life changed with devastating speed. He was moved to luxurious quarters, dressed in silk and velvet, and granted privileges that other pages could only imagine. He had achieved what the system promised. He had become special. The reality of this specialness was far more complex than the glittering surface suggested. The favored pages attended the Sultan in his most private moments. They dressed him, bathed him, served his meals, and accompanied him to his bedchamber. The nature of these intimate services varied depending on the Sultan's inclinations, but the historical record, though deliberately vague, contains enough hints to reconstruct a troubling picture. European ambassadors, who observed the Ottoman court with fascinated horror, reported seeing young pages seated on the Sultan's lap during private gatherings. They described boys perfumed and painted, their hair grown long in deliberate contrast to the severe appearance expected of Ottoman officials. Ottoman poetry from this era is particularly revealing. Court poets wrote verses addressed to beautiful boys, using language that was simultaneously romantic and possessive. These poems described lips like rubies, skin like moonlight, and the agony of separation from a beloved youth. While defenders of the Ottoman court have argued that such poetry was merely conventional expression borrowed from Persian literary tradition, the poems written by sultans themselves about specific named pages leave little room for innocent interpretation. These were not abstract celebrations of beauty, but explicit declarations of desire directed at real young men under absolute royal control. The pages who entered this world of imperial favor found themselves in a golden cage with razor-wire bars. They lived in rooms decorated with precious carpets and illuminated manuscripts. They ate delicacies prepared by the finest palace chefs. They wore clothes that cost more than most subjects earned in a year. But they could not leave, could not refuse any command, and could not escape the constant awareness that their position depended entirely on maintaining the Sultan's interest, an interest that might evaporate at any moment. The psychological impact of this existence was profound. These young men, some still boys really, had to navigate an impossible emotional landscape. They were expected to display genuine affection and devotion to the man who owned them absolutely, who could order their death with a gesture. They had to compete with dozens of other pages for attention while maintaining the appearance of harmonious brotherhood. They had to accept physical intimacies that they had never chosen, all while projecting an image of willing participation, even enthusiasm. Some pages developed genuine emotional attachments to their sultan, a phenomenon psychologists would later recognize as a form of trauma bonding. When your entire world consists of pleasing one person, when every comfort and safety depends on that person's approval, the mind protects itself by creating feelings of affection and loyalty. The alternative, to consciously acknowledge one's complete powerlessness and exploitation, was too psychologically devastating to bear. So they convinced themselves, or appeared to convince themselves, that they were honored, that they were loved, that their situation was privilege rather than captivity. The other pages watched with complex emotions. Jealousy was inevitable and carefully cultivated by the system. If one boy gained favor, others saw their own chances diminishing. This created an atmosphere of constant competition that prevented solidarity and made the pages police each other's behavior. A boy who showed signs of discontent might find himself reported by a rival, hoping to improve his own position. This internal surveillance was far more effective than any guard system could be, turning the victims themselves into enforcers of their own oppression. The eunuchs who supervised the pages were themselves products of similar violence, having been castrated and enslaved years earlier. Some showed kindness to the boys under their charge, remembering their own suffering. Others became petty tyrants, wielding the limited power granted them with cruel enthusiasm. The most dangerous were those who had learned to profit from the system, taking bribes from pages desperate for favorable reports or advance warning of the Sultan's moods. Beyond the palace walls, in the markets and coffee houses of Istanbul, rumors circulated about the beautiful boys who served the Sultan. Some stories were romantic, painting the pages as lucky youths who had transcended common life to dwell in paradise. Others were darker, whispered tales of boys who had displeased their master and disappeared, their bodies found floating in the Bosphorus or not found at all. The truth, as always, lay somewhere between myth and nightmare, more disturbing than the romantic tales and more systematic than the random cruelties. The Sultan's favor could elevate a page to extraordinary heights, but it could also doom him instantly. There are documented cases of pages who were strangled in the palace gardens because they had looked at the Sultan's wife with what was interpreted as desire. Others were executed because they had failed to laugh at a joke, suggesting disrespect. Some were killed because the Sultan had dreamed they had betrayed him, and in the Ottoman palace, imperial dreams carried the weight of evidence. One particularly well-documented case involves a page named Hussein, who served Sultan Ibrahim VI in the 1640s. According to palace records and the accounts of European observers, Hussein was renowned for his beauty and his skill at playing the ney, the traditional reed flute. Sultan Ibrahim became obsessed with the youth, showering him with gifts and attention that made other courtiers jealous. For 2 years, Hussein lived as one of the most privileged individuals in the empire, wearing clothes that glittered with jewels and exercising informal influence over minor appointments. But Ibrahim was known for his mental instability, his rapid mood swings, and his capacity for sudden violence. One evening during a musical performance, Hussein made a small error in his playing. A note held slightly too long. The Sultan's face darkened. He stood, pointed at Hussein, and walked out of the chamber. By morning, Hussein was dead, strangled by the palace executioners. His body was sewn into a weighted sack and thrown into the sea, the standard disposal method for disfavored courtiers. No trial, no defense, no second chance. The Sultan's displeasure was sufficient evidence, sufficient judgment, sufficient execution. The other pages learned from Hussein's fate, as they were meant to. They learned that perfection was not enough, that luck was as important as skill, and that the love of a sultan was the most dangerous form of affection imaginable. They learned to pray not just for continued favor, but for the sultan's death, which at least offered the possibility of survival under a new master who might not remember their faces or their associations with his predecessor. Yet despite these horrors, many pages did survive and even prosper. The Ottoman system, for all its cruelty, was not purely destructive. It was a machine for converting human raw material into useful tools, and many of those tools went on to serve the empire in important roles. When a page aged out of his usefulness to the Sultan, when his beard grew thick and his face lost the soft beauty that had attracted imperial attention, he was typically transferred to other positions. The most successful became provincial governors, military commanders, or high-ranking bureaucrats. These former favorites often carried their experiences like invisible scars. Some became notorious for their own exploitation of young subordinates, perpetuating the cycle of abuse they had endured. Others devoted themselves to good governance and acts of charity, perhaps attempting to redeem their compromised past through virtuous action. A few left behind writings that hint at their psychological state, describing themselves as ghosts who had survived their own deaths, or as men who had sold their souls for silk. The transformation from favored page to government official involved its own challenges. These young men, who had spent their formative years focused entirely on pleasing the Sultan, now had to develop administrative skills and political acumen. Many failed, proving unable to transition from intimate service to independent command. They found themselves isolated, too elevated for their former peers, but never truly accepted by the traditional aristocracy who viewed them as upstarts and sexual playthings who had slept their way to power. The stigma attached to these positions was complex and often hypocritical. Ottoman society officially condemned sexual relations between men, yet everyone understood that the Sultan's pages served him in ways that went beyond administrative duties. This contradiction was managed through strategic silence. Direct discussion of what occurred in the privy chamber was effectively taboo, allowing people to maintain public denial while harboring private knowledge. This willful blindness was essential to the system's functioning, creating a shared fiction that protected the empire's image while enabling continued exploitation. The women of the imperial harem viewed the male pages with a mixture of contempt, jealousy, and tactical interest. The harem itself was another institution built on slavery and sexual exploitation, but its dynamics differed significantly. The concubines and wives of the Sultan competed for his attention and the opportunity to bear his children, which could secure their position and that of their offspring. The male pages represented a different kind of competition, one that threatened not just individual women, but the entire system of dynastic succession. A sultan who devoted too much attention to beautiful boys might neglect his concubines entirely, producing no heirs and threatening the empire's stability. There are historical instances where the Valid Sultan, the sultan's mother and often the most powerful woman in the empire, intervened to remove pages she perceived as excessive distractions. These interventions were conducted with remarkable subtlety, using palace intrigue, false accusations, and manufactured scandals to eliminate the competition without directly confronting the Sultan's desires. One famous incident occurred during the reign of Sultan Mehmed IV in the 1670s. A young page named Suleyman had captured the Sultan's complete attention, reportedly spending every night in the imperial bedchamber. The Valide Sultan Turhan, concerned that her son was neglecting both governance and the production of heirs, orchestrated a scheme in which Suleyman was accused of plotting with foreign ambassadors. The evidence was fabricated, but it was convincing enough to create doubt in Mehmed's mind. Suleyman was quietly transferred to a distant province, ostensibly promoted but effectively exiled. He died 3 years later under circumstances the historical record describes as suspicious. The palace eunuchs played crucial roles in these machinations. As castrated males, they occupied a unique position, able to move freely between the male and female sections of the palace. Many eunuchs had their own agendas, accumulating wealth and influence through their positions as intermediaries. Some allied with the harem women against the pages, while others protected the pages in exchange for future favors once the youths achieved positions of power. The result was a constantly shifting web of alliances and betrayals, where today's protector might become tomorrow's destroyer. For the pages themselves, navigating this treacherous landscape required skills no training could fully provide. They had to be simultaneously attractive enough to hold the Sultan's interest and modest enough not to provoke jealousy. They had to cultivate allies without appearing to form factions. They had to demonstrate loyalty while preparing for the inevitable moment when they would be discarded. It was an impossible balance, and most failed to achieve it for long. The religious establishment's position on these practices was characterized by strategic ambiguity. Islamic law, as interpreted by Ottoman scholars, technically prohibited sexual relations between men. The penalty for such acts, according to some schools of jurisprudence, was death. Yet the same religious scholars who preached against such sin were supported by the Sultan's treasury and served at his pleasure. The result was a remarkable exercise in interpretive flexibility. Ottoman religious scholars developed elaborate theoretical frameworks that allowed them to condemn homosexual acts in the abstract while ignoring concrete evidence of their occurrence in the palace. They distinguished between active and passive partners, between relationships based on love and those based on lust, and between public scandals that threatened social order and private conduct that remained discreetly hidden. These distinctions had no basis in the core religious texts, but served the essential function of allowing the system to continue while maintaining Islam's official moral authority. Some scholars went further, producing treatises that argued the love of beautiful boys was actually spiritually elevated, a reflection of divine beauty that lifted the soul toward contemplation of God. These works, though controversial, circulated among the educated elite and provided intellectual cover for practices that were simultaneously occurring and officially denied. The cognitive dissonance this created was managed through the same mechanism used throughout the system: strategic compartmentalization, the ability to hold contradictory beliefs simultaneously by never examining them together. Foreign observers, particularly European ambassadors and travelers, were both fascinated and horrified by what they witnessed at the Ottoman court. Their accounts, though colored by their own cultural prejudices and often exaggerated for dramatic effect, provide valuable external perspectives on the page system. These observers noted details that Ottoman sources deliberately omitted, describing in explicit terms what court chronicles referred to only through euphemism. A Venetian ambassador named Ottaviano Bon, writing in 1604, described watching Sultan Ahmed I during a private entertainment. The Sultan, he reported, was surrounded by pages of exceeding beauty, attired in cloth of gold and precious stones. Throughout the evening, the Sultan did fondle them openly, kissing and embracing them in a manner that left no doubt of his intentions. Bon noted that the other courtiers present behaved as though nothing unusual was occurring, maintaining a studied ignorance of what transpired before their very eyes. These European accounts were often used as propaganda, presented as evidence of Ottoman decadence and moral corruption that justified Christian Europe's hostility toward the empire. Yet however much these observers were motivated by political and religious prejudice, their descriptions align too consistently with other evidence to be dismissed as pure fabrication. They notice the same patterns: the selection of beautiful boys, their transformation into elegant pages, their intimate service to the Sultan, and the complex system of favor and displacement that governed their lives. The long-term psychological damage inflicted by this system is difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. These were young people whose sexuality, identity, and autonomy were colonized during their most formative years. They learned that their value as human beings was entirely dependent on their physical attractiveness and their ability to please a master. They experienced intimacy only as a transaction, affection only as a tool of survival. Some adapted to this reality and carried these lessons into their adult lives, viewing all relationships through the lens of power and utility. Others simply broke. The historical record contains tantalizing hints of pages who attempted suicide, who went mad, or who ran away despite the near certainty of being caught and executed. One chronicle from 1702 mentions a page who threw himself from a palace tower after being informed he was being transferred out of the privy chamber. Another source describes a youth who stopped eating and drinking, slowly starving himself to death while his supervisors watched helplessly. These acts of desperate agency, of choosing one's own death over continued participation in the system, were the only forms of resistance available to those completely trapped. The most haunting aspect of this history is how thoroughly it has been erased from collective memory. Modern Turkey, in constructing its national identity after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, chose to emphasize the glorious military conquests, the architectural achievements, and the cosmopolitan sophistication of the imperial past. The darker aspects, the slavery, the sexual exploitation, the systematic abuse of power, were quietly omitted from official narratives. Museums display the jeweled daggers and illuminated manuscripts, but rarely mention the young boys whose labor and suffering made such luxury possible. This erasure was not accidental, but a deliberate project of national myth-making. As Turkey modernized and adopted Western legal codes in the early 20th century, many Ottoman practices were reframed as barbaric remnants of a backward age. The Republic needed to distinguish itself from its imperial predecessor, to present itself as enlightened and European rather than despotic and Oriental. Acknowledging the full extent of the Ottoman court's sexual exploitation would have complicated this narrative, so it was simply suppressed. The few Turkish historians who have attempted to examine this topic honestly have faced significant resistance. Accusations of insulting Turkish dignity, of pandering to Western prejudices, or of distorting history for sensational purposes have dogged serious scholarly work. The result is that even today, comprehensive Turkish language histories of the Ottoman palace often treat the page system with remarkable delicacy, using euphemisms and omissions that obscure more than they reveal. Western historians have been somewhat more direct, but they face different challenges. Writing about the sexual exploitation of young boys in historical context requires navigating contemporary sensitivities around child abuse, while avoiding the trap of imposing current moral standards on past societies. The result is often scholarship that dances around the subject, acknowledging what occurred while maintaining a tone of clinical distance that can feel inappropriately sterile given the human suffering involved. What compounds the tragedy is that some of these young men, despite everything they endured, achieved remarkable things. A page named Ibrahim, who served Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1520s, rose to become Grand Vizier, effectively the empire's prime minister. He oversaw military campaigns, negotiated with foreign powers, and patronized artists and architects whose works still stand today. Yet his ascent began with his selection as a beautiful youth purchased in a slave market, and it ended when Suleiman had him strangled in 1536 over a court intrigue. His brilliance and achievements could not protect him from the fundamental reality that he remained property, subject to disposal at his owner's whim. The question of agency in such circumstances is philosophically complex. Did these pages choose their fates? In the narrowest sense, many made choices to excel in their studies, to cultivate attractive qualities, to seek the Sultan's attention. But these choices occurred within a context of absolute coercion, where the alternative to participation was punishment or death. To call such choices free would be an abuse of language. They were strategic responses to captivity, survival mechanisms rather than expressions of authentic desire. Some modern defenders of the Ottoman system have argued that the page institution provided opportunities for social mobility that would have been impossible otherwise. This argument, while technically accurate in some cases, is deeply misleading. Yes, a Christian peasant boy from Albania had virtually no chance of becoming a provincial governor through conventional means. But the fact that slavery and sexual exploitation occasionally led to advancement does not transform them into benign institutions. The possibility of escape or success does not justify a prison, and the existence of a few success stories does not redeem a system built on the suffering of thousands. It's also worth noting that the opportunities provided by the page system were only necessary because the Ottoman state had created the conditions of oppression in the first place. These boys were not rescued from poverty. They were forcibly removed from their families and communities. The advancement they might achieve was only meaningful because the system had first reduced them to nothing. To credit the Ottoman Empire for elevating those it had enslaved is to adopt the perspective of the oppressor, for whom the elevation of a favored slave demonstrates benevolence rather than cruelty. The comparison with the Ottoman practice of recruiting janissaries, elite soldiers, also taken as boys from Christian families, is instructive. Both systems involved forced conversion, rigorous training, and the possibility of achieving high status. But while janissaries have been extensively studied and their story is relatively well known, the pages have remained obscure. The reason for this disparity is obvious. The janissaries could be celebrated as elite warriors and loyal servants of the state without addressing uncomfortable questions about sexuality. The pages cannot be discussed without confronting what their service actually entailed. As the Ottoman Empire entered its final centuries, the page system gradually changed. The rigid selection and training processes broke down. More pages came from within the palace itself, sons of officials and concubines rather than captives from distant provinces. The intimate services once provided by pages were increasingly handled by other attendants. By the 19th century, as the empire desperately attempted to modernize along European lines, the entire institution was viewed as an embarrassing anachronism. The Tanzimat reforms, beginning in 1839, represented an attempt to transform the Ottoman Empire into a constitutional state governed by law rather than personal whim. Slavery was officially abolished in 1847, though the law was unevenly enforced and many practices continued under different names. The palace continued to employ young male attendants, but their role became more administrative and less intimate. The old system's explicit sexual dimension faded, replaced by arrangements that were marginally less coercive, even if still deeply problematic. When the Ottoman Empire finally collapsed after World War I and Turkey emerged as a republic under Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the new government consciously broke with the imperial past. The palace was converted into a museum, its remaining residents evicted. The Sultan's personal rule was replaced by secular republican law, and the page system, already moribund, was simply eliminated without ceremony or acknowledgement. The boys who had once served the empire's rulers were not pensioned or compensated. They were simply rendered obsolete and forgotten. Today, visitors to Topkapi Palace Museum can walk through the same chambers where pages once lived and served. They can admire the exquisite tilework, the beautiful calligraphy, and the lavish furnishings. What they cannot see, what the museum deliberately does not show them, are the chains that bound those who lived there. The beauty of the palace was built on suffering, and the silence that now fills its rooms is the silence of erasure, of truths too uncomfortable to display beside the jeweled daggers and illuminated Qur'an. The legacy of the page system extends beyond the individuals who experienced it directly. It established patterns of exploitation that persisted long after the formal institution disappeared. The idea that power grants unlimited access to other people's bodies, that beauty is a commodity to be harvested and consumed, that children can be transformed into objects for adult pleasure. These concepts did not die with the Ottoman Empire. They reappear throughout history in different forms, and they remain with us today in the continued existence of child trafficking, sexual exploitation, and the systematic abuse of vulnerable young people by those who hold power over them. Understanding this history is not an exercise in condemning the past from a position of moral superiority. It is recognizing that the same human capacities for cruelty, rationalization, and strategic blindness that enabled the Ottoman page system exist in every society, including our own. When powerful institutions abuse children, when exploitation is justified through elaborate intellectual frameworks, when everyone knows but no one speaks, these are not uniquely Ottoman phenomena, but persistent human failures. The story of the Ottoman pages also challenges simplistic narratives about progress. Yes, the formal institution was abolished, and modern Turkey no longer enslaves Christian boys for the Sultan's pleasure. But exploitation has not disappeared. It has merely changed forms. Children are still trafficked, still forced into sexual servitude, still made to serve the desires of those more powerful than themselves. The mechanisms differ, but the underlying dynamic, the conversion of human beings into consumable objects, remains tragically familiar. What makes the Ottoman case particularly disturbing is not just the suffering it involved, but the systematic nature of its denial. This was not a hidden crime or a shameful secret. It was an official institution supported by elaborate bureaucracy, celebrated in poetry, and defended by religious scholars. Everyone involved knew what was occurring, yet they constructed elaborate mental frameworks that allowed them to participate or tolerate participation. This capacity for collective self-deception, for knowing and not knowing simultaneously, is one of humanity's most dangerous traits. The boys themselves left behind almost no direct testimony. They were not encouraged to write their own stories, and most probably lacked the literacy or opportunity to do so, even if they wished. What survived are fragments, a few letters, some poetry that might be autobiographical, and the indirect evidence in administrative records and foreign observers' accounts. These fragments sketch the outlines of lives we can never fully recover, leaving us to imagine the interior experiences of people reduced to historical footnotes. One of the few direct statements comes from a memoir written by a former page named Mehmed, who served in the palace in the 1750s and later became a minor official. His account, discovered in an Istanbul archive in the 1970s, is remarkable for its frankness. He describes the terrible beauty of the palace, the way luxury and suffering intertwined until one could not imagine one without the other. He writes of nights spent in the Sultan's chamber, serving in ways that shame forbids me to describe in detail. He concludes with a chilling observation. I learned that a man can survive anything, even the death of his own soul, and that survival is not the same as life. The psychological literature on trauma and captivity provides frameworks for understanding what these young men experienced. Concepts like learned helplessness, complex PTSD, and trauma bonding illuminate the mechanisms through which people adapt to sustained abuse. But clinical terminology, however useful, cannot fully capture the lived reality of a childhood spent in such circumstances. The pages were not case studies, but individual human beings, each with their own internal universe of hopes, fears, and adaptations. Some of the pages we know formed relationships with each other, bonds of genuine affection that existed within and despite the competitive atmosphere. These relationships were risky. Any perception of faction or conspiracy could be dangerous. Yet the human need for connection is powerful enough to overcome even severe risk. Letters between pages occasionally surface in archives, written in elaborate code, and expressing emotions that range from tender affection to desperate longing. Whether these relationships were romantic, sexual, or simply the profound attachment that develops between people surviving shared trauma is impossible to determine, and perhaps not particularly important. They represent moments of humanity persisting within a dehumanizing system. The medical practices associated with the page system deserve mention. Many pages were given special diets and treatments designed to preserve their youthful appearance and delay puberty. Recipes from palace physicians include mixtures of herbs claimed to keep the face soft and beardless, or to maintain the sweetness of the voice. Whether these concoctions had any physiological effect beyond placebo is doubtful, but their existence reveals the anxieties surrounding the inevitable aging that would end a page's value to the Sultan. Some boys were subjected to more drastic interventions. There are oblique references in medical texts to procedures performed on pages to preserve their usefulness. The exact nature of these procedures is unclear, deliberately obscured by euphemistic language, but they appear to have involved some form of chemical or surgical intervention aimed at preventing or delaying physical maturation. The ethics of subjecting children to such treatments without their meaningful consent need not be stated. The horror is self-evident. The architecture of the palace itself reflects the page system's priorities. The Has Oda, where the favored pages lived, was positioned to be easily accessible from the Sultan's private apartments, but completely isolated from the outside world. The windows were set high in the walls, providing light but preventing views of the city beyond. The doors were few and heavily guarded. Even the decoration, beautiful but repetitive, with geometric patterns that drew the eye inward, created an environment designed to focus attention on the interior space rather than any world beyond it. This architectural imprisonment was matched by sartorial control. The pages wore distinctive clothing that marked their status and simultaneously restricted their movement. The elaborate robes, while beautiful, were designed to require assistance in dressing and undressing, making independence difficult. The soft indoor slippers, unsuitable for walking outdoors, served as a subtle reminder that these young men were not expected to go anywhere. Every aspect of their material existence reinforced their dependency and captivity. The palace's acoustic properties also played a role in the system. The thick walls and carpeted floors muffled sound, creating an atmosphere of eerie quiet, broken only by carefully orchestrated music or the sounds of the Sultan's pleasure. This sonic isolation prevented pages from communicating easily with each other and ensured that what occurred in the privy chamber remained private. The silence was itself a form of control, making resistance difficult to organize and suffering difficult to share. The destruction of records presents significant challenges for historians. When the Ottoman Empire fell and Turkey became a republic, many palace documents were deliberately destroyed. Some burning was practical, making space in overcrowded archives, but other destruction seems to have been motivated by a desire to erase evidence of practices the new state found embarrassing. Entire categories of records, including detailed inventories of pages, their assignments and their fates, were systematically eliminated. What survived did so either by accident or because it seemed innocuous. Administrative records listing page appointments to provincial posts are available. Poetry mentioning beautiful youths exists in abundance. But the specific details of daily life in the privy chamber, the intimate practices and their justifications, were largely lost. This makes historical reconstruction challenging and forces reliance on indirect evidence and foreign accounts, which bring their own biases and limitations. The linguistic analysis of Ottoman texts reveals fascinating patterns of evasion and euphemism. Words that in ordinary contexts meant simple service or attendance acquired different meanings when applied to pages. Phrases describing intimate service or private duties functioned as code, allowing writers to reference sexual exploitation without stating it explicitly. This linguistic camouflage was so effective that even today, scholars sometimes debate whether certain passages describe abuse or merely close personal service, as though there were meaningful distinction between the two in a context of absolute power imbalance. The role of alcohol and drugs in the page system is worth examining. The Ottoman court, despite Islam's prohibition on intoxication, consumed substantial quantities of wine and opium. These substances were particularly important in the context of the privy chamber, where they served multiple functions. For the Sultan, they might ease conscience or enhance pleasure. For the pages, they offered temporary escape from their circumstances. Some boys developed serious addictions, which further increased their dependency and made them easier to control. Palace records occasionally mention pages being disciplined for drunkenness or opium use, suggesting that self-medication was common enough to be a recognized problem. Yet the palace itself provided these substances, creating a situation where the same institution that punished intoxication also enabled it. This contradiction, like so many others in the system, was managed through strategic inconsistency, enforcing rules when convenient while ignoring violations when useful. The economic dimension of the page system extended far beyond the palace walls. The slave markets where boys were purchased became specialized centers of trade, with dealers developing expertise in procuring the specific qualities Ottoman officials desired. Families in the Caucasus region sometimes raised sons deliberately for this market, investing in their education and appearance in hopes of securing a high price. This created perverse incentives that turned child trafficking into an organized industry. The price of a suitable page candidate could be extraordinary. Records from the 17th century show individual boys selling for amounts equivalent to several years' wages for a skilled craftsman. The most exceptional cases, boys of remarkable beauty or talent, commanded prices comparable to houses or small estates. This commodification of children had ripple effects throughout the empire's economy, creating fortunes for slave traders while devastating the communities from which the boys were taken. The Christian communities subjected to this predation developed various strategies of resistance and adaptation. Some villages hid their most attractive boys when Ottoman officials arrived. Others deliberately scarred their sons' faces to make them unsuitable for selection. A few communities converted to Islam, believing this would protect their children, only to discover that the palace sometimes took Muslim boys as well, though less frequently. These desperate measures reveal the terror the Devshirme system inspired in subject populations. Ottoman responses to resistance were brutal. Villages that hindered the collection of pages faced collective punishment, including higher taxes, destruction of property, or military occupation. The message was clear. Children were not truly the property of their families, but resources of the state to be harvested as needed. This assertion of absolute power over the most intimate family relationships was among the most totalitarian aspects of the Ottoman system. The role of mothers in this history is particularly tragic. Sources occasionally record mothers attempting to hide sons, bribing officials, or even killing their children rather than surrendering them. These extreme actions, born of desperate love, were treated as criminal rebellion against the state. Women who interfered with page collection could be punished severely, up to and including execution. The system deliberately broke the bond between mother and child, recognizing correctly that this relationship was the primary obstacle to complete control. When boys were taken, families were typically given no information about their fate. There was no correspondence allowed, no visiting rights, and no promise of future contact. Parents simply had to live with the knowledge that their son had been absorbed into the palace and would never return, even if he achieved great success. Some families heard rumors years later that their son had become a governor or had died in the palace, but most lived with permanent uncertainty, a grief without closure or resolution. The psychological impact on these communities was profound and transgenerational. Parents who had lost children to the palace system raised their remaining children with a mixture of overprotection and emotional distance, knowing that attachment created vulnerability. Siblings of taken boys grew up with survivor guilt and fear of their own selection. Entire villages developed cultures of anxiety around the presence of Ottoman officials, traumatized communities living under the constant threat of having their children harvested. The end of the page system did not bring justice or acknowledgement to its victims. There was no reckoning, no apology, and no compensation. The pages who had survived and achieved positions of power rarely spoke publicly about their experiences, carrying their trauma in silence. Those who had been discarded or who had failed to rise simply disappeared from history, their suffering unrecorded and unremembered. In the decades following the empire's collapse, a few former pages published memoirs or gave interviews. These accounts, while valuable, were typically heavily edited and euphemistic, constrained by social propriety and legal concerns. Even in a new political system, the subjects remained too sensitive for frank discussion. Authors would describe their education and advancement, while passing over their years of intimate service with vague phrases about loyal attendance or special duties. The Republic's official history textbooks mentioned the Enderun School as an institution that produced capable administrators, but omitted any discussion of its darker purposes. Generations of Turkish students learned about the palace pages as proof of Ottoman meritocracy. Look, even Christian peasant boys could rise to power without understanding the abuse that accompanied this supposed opportunity. This selective memory served the national narrative but dishonored those who had suffered. International scholarship slowly began uncovering the full picture, but progress was uneven and contested. Early 20th century European historians were often too eager to condemn Ottoman barbarism in ways that reflected their own prejudices rather than careful analysis. Mid-century scholars, reacting against this Orientalist bias, sometimes overcorrected by minimizing or excusing Ottoman practices. Only in recent decades has more balanced scholarship emerged, capable of examining the page system critically without either sensationalizing it for political purposes or whitewashing it out of cultural sensitivity. One significant breakthrough came with the translation and analysis of previously neglected sources. Historians working in Ottoman archives discovered administrative records, medical texts, and religious legal opinions that, when read carefully, revealed details about the page system that official chronicles had obscured. These documents, never intended for public consumption, were less constrained by propriety and therefore more revealing about actual practices. Archaeological work at Topkapi Palace has also contributed to understanding. Excavations in areas once used by pages have uncovered personal items, jewelry, small mirrors, cosmetics, and religious amulets that speak to their daily lives. One particularly poignant discovery was a small wooden box containing several locks of hair tied with silk ribbon hidden in a wall cavity. Whether these were kept as mementos of lost families, tokens of affection between pages, or something else entirely remains unknown, but they testify to the persistence of individual humanity within the system. The modern Turkish attitude toward this history remains complicated. There is pride in the Ottoman Empire's achievements and discomfort with its darker aspects. Discussions of the page system often provoke defensive reactions, with critics accused of promoting Western stereotypes of Oriental decadence. Yet younger generations of Turkish historians, less invested in maintaining nationalist myths, are increasingly willing to examine their imperial past with honest eyes. This generational shift in historical consciousness reflects broader changes in how societies confront uncomfortable histories. Around the world, nations are gradually acknowledging the injustices embedded in their pasts. Colonial exploitation, slavery, genocide, and systematic abuse. The Ottoman page system, while specific in its details, represents a universal human failing, the willingness of civilized, cultured societies to build their splendor on the suffering of the vulnerable. The legal framework surrounding historical child abuse has made some aspects of this research ethically complex. While events centuries in the past are obviously beyond any legal jurisdiction, the nature of the material requires careful handling. Historians must describe what occurred without sensationalizing it, acknowledge the exploitation without reproducing or participating in it, and honor the victims without reducing them to their victimization. What should we do with this knowledge? The impulse to judge, to condemn those long dead for practices we now recognize as abhorrent, is natural but limited in its usefulness. The Ottoman sultans and officials who maintained the page system are beyond any earthly accountability. What matters is not adjudicating their guilt, but understanding the mechanisms that enabled such systematic abuse and recognizing those mechanisms where they appear today. The page system depended on several key elements, all of which remain relevant. A power structure that treated certain categories of people as less than fully human. An ideology that justified exploitation in the name of higher purposes like state necessity or religious service. a conspiracy of silence in which everyone knew but no one acknowledged, economic incentives that made trafficking profitable, and a culture that eroticized and romanticized what was fundamentally abuse. Each of these elements appears, in different forms, in contemporary instances of exploitation. Child trafficking networks that supply sex industries operate through similar mechanisms of capture, isolation, and psychological manipulation. The ideological justifications differ, economic rather than political necessity, but they serve the same function of making the unacceptable seem inevitable. The conspiracy of silence that allowed the page system to flourish has parallels in every institution where sexual abuse occurs and is systematically ignored. Recognizing these parallels is not about drawing simplistic equations between Ottoman practices and modern abuses. Historical contexts differ profoundly, and careful distinctions matter. But the underlying psychology of exploitation, the ways that power corrupts and institutions protect themselves rather than the vulnerable, these are constant across time and culture. The boys who served Ottoman sultans and the children trafficked today are separated by centuries, but united by their reduction to objects for others' use. The particular form of exploitation experienced by the Ottoman pages, combining enslavement, sexual abuse, and paradoxical privilege, created a unique psychological damage. Unlike slaves who were simply degraded, the pages were simultaneously exalted and destroyed. They were told they were special, chosen, honored while being systematically violated. This combination of abuse and specialness made resistance particularly difficult, as it complicated the victim's ability to recognize their own oppression. This pattern appears in many forms of institutional abuse, particularly in contexts where victims are told they are privileged to be chosen for abuse. Religious institutions that abuse children while claiming to be conferring spiritual blessing. Educational institutions that exploit students while framing it as mentorship. Artistic institutions that abuse young performers while claiming to be developing their talent. All employ similar tactics of confusing privilege with violation. The intergenerational transmission of trauma from the page system can still be traced in some families. Ottoman records sometimes allow us to track lineages descended from former pages, and oral histories occasionally preserve family stories about ancestors who were taken to the palace. These stories are often fragmentary and mythologized, with the darker elements either forgotten or deliberately suppressed. But they testify to the lasting impact of historical abuse on family systems across centuries. One such family story involves descendants of a page named Ali, who served in the 1730s and later became governor of a Balkan province. The family preserved letters and documents that, when examined by historians in the 1990s, revealed Ali's biography in painful detail. His descendants had been told he was a success story, a poor boy who rose to power through merit. The documents showed that his rise began with his selection at age 12 for his beauty, his service in the Sultan's bedchamber, and the psychological devastation he experienced that led to what the records describe as melancholic fits throughout his later life. The family's response to learning this fuller history was mixed. Some felt their ancestors' achievement was diminished by acknowledging the abuse he endured. Others felt that acknowledging the truth honored his resilience more than maintaining a sanitized myth. These differing reactions reflect broader tensions in how we engage with difficult pasts, whether we focus on victimization or survival, on the damage done or the life built despite it. The artistic and literary legacy of the page system is substantial and problematic. Ottoman poetry celebrating beautiful boys includes some of the empire's finest verse, technically brilliant and emotionally complex. These poems are still studied and admired, but their celebration of coercive relationships under radical power imbalance makes their aesthetic beauty morally complicated. Can we appreciate the craftsmanship while acknowledging the exploitation it describes? Should such works be taught, And if so, how? Similar questions arise with visual art. Ottoman miniature paintings often depict beautiful youths in ways that are simultaneously artistic achievements and representations of exploitation. Museum exhibitions face choices about how to contextualize such images. Too little context allows audiences to appreciate them as simply beautiful art, erasing the reality of what they depict. Too much context risks reducing the art to mere historical evidence of abuse, denying its aesthetic complexity. The silence that once filled the chambers of Topkapi Palace, the silence imposed by power and maintained through fear, need not be permanent. We can break that silence by speaking these truths, however uncomfortable they make us. We can refuse to let beauty and sophistication distract us from the suffering they concealed, and we can honor those who suffered by ensuring that we do not replicate in whatever contemporary forms the systems that destroyed them. The secret life of Istanbul's male concubines was built on silence, maintained through denial and preserved through erasure. But secrets, however well kept, eventually surface. The truth, however uncomfortable, eventually demands acknowledgement, and the dead, however forgotten, eventually find voices through those willing to bear witness. This has been that witnessing, incomplete, imperfect, but necessary. May it serve not just to inform, but to challenge, not just to document the past, but to change the present, and not just to remember victims, but to prevent future victimization.